Remove it for now. He dipped a kerchief into the bucket. Oh, what is it? Let me prepare fresh water. No, that would be too much trouble. This is fine. Maomao didn't say anything more, but she stared at the bucket. It didn't look too filthy, but is something the matter? Jinchi asked. No, sir, nothing. She had dipped her feet in the bucket after washing her hair, but she could keep that to herself. Jinchi did not seem bothered by the used water, so she decided there was no need to trouble herself getting more. She took the damp kerchief and rubbed at his face. It was a nice new cotton handkerchief, but it quickly grew grungy with dye and glue. Maomao thought it was a waste. The cloth probably would not come clean, even with careful washing. She wished he had used a less perfect rag. Jinchi closed his eyes and let her work. He seemed to enjoy the feel of the warm, damp cloth. He seemed so completely unguarded. She worried someone might chop his head off and the assassin would laugh. Can athlete's foot spread to the face? Maomao did not have athlete's foot, to be clear. The glue dissolved, revealing Jinchi's bare skin. It was smooth and healthy, although another wound was still visible, slashing across it. There was still some redness around the scar. It would likely fade with time to an extent, but it would never go away completely. It would be with him the rest of his life. Master Jinchi? Yes. Why are we stopping by the master physician's house? And Maomao was coming with us, no less. It's on the way to our destination. I thought we might as well take a look, since we were going to be passing through anyway. On the way to our destination, to her that meant going home would take even more time than coming out. Where in the world are we headed? Honestly, this is convenient timing. It gives me a chance to see the reaction to the increased taxes firsthand. That much is true. Each year when taxes were collected, the quantity of the harvest was considered. It was compared to the local population, and the ratio was checked. This ensured that no one was facing an undue burden. But those were ultimately just numbers. They could only be trusted so far. Besides, something strange is going on around here. What is that, sir? I'm afraid I don't quite know. I only know that your cousin used his abacus and he thinks something is off. Lahan's fixation on numbers was legendary. He was a card-carrying eccentric who worked day and night seeking ever more beautiful numbers, even if he couldn't make them quite perfect. If he had brought the matter to Jinchi, there was almost certainly something going on. He claims there is an aberration in the amount of rice they have shipped these past few years. Eccentric Lahan might be, but he wasn't apt to be mistaken on a point like that. That is what brought me here, but look at what else we found. We cannot have professional paper producers replaced with a bunch of people who don't know anything, especially as we are trying to ramp up production. So this was more than just a sightseeing diversion. He was doing real work. Now she felt especially bad as he washed his face with her foot water. Jinchi must have been getting sleepy, for he gradually slumped on the bed until he was lying down. Maomao thought about how much trouble he could be. She sat on the bed and began gently stroking his hair. He wasn't wearing perfume, but a faintly floral scent still wafted from him. Just how much like one of those celestial maidens was he? Shall I redo your burn now? Or would you rather wait until morning? Now, please. His drowsy voice was more alluring than usual. Considering she could cause a veritable disaster if she kicked him out of her room right now, Maomao stirred the glue and dye with her finger. She added some water to give it the right consistency, then began to daub it around his scar. I wonder who thought of this. It looked awfully convincing. It might not stand up to getting wet, but they were in the dry season when it very rarely rained. Couldn't Master Basin do this? He doesn't quite have the talent. So this is why you brought me along. It's not the only reason. Jinchi seemed to like physical contact. He closed his eyes as a child would as she spread the glue around with the tips of her fingers. Don't fall asleep, she warned him. I'll call Master Basin first. How helpful do you think he would be if you did? Not very, he admitted. Basin did not yet have her father Gaeshun's knack. She felt he lacked a certain forcefulness as Jinchi's assistant. Why is he your assistant anyway? She asked before she could stop herself. She hadn't seen Gaeshun for quite a while, and she missed the restorative effect he had on her. She missed the middle-aged man's occasional mischievous streak. Jinchi slowly opened his eyes a little wider. The dark pupils showed a shade of surprise. I know how he can seem, but he is perfectly competent when it matters. If you'll forgive my saying so, sir, you don't sound very convinced. Maybe Jinchi was a little soft on Basin. They were milk brothers after all. Then again, if Basin was genuinely comfortable around Jinchi, that was a sort of talent in itself. Maomao finished the burn makeup and was about to wash her goopy hand when she had a thought. She used her clean hand to reach for her luggage and pulled out the bronze sheet she used as a mirror. Then she tried painting the stuff around her mouth. She grinned, looking like a monster. Jinchi laughed and said, "That is positively awful." Maomao thought she could simply wash the goop off again. She then wanted to paint it around her eyes and cheeks. A truly disturbing face now floated on the bronze plate, looking almost corpse-like. Jinchi was completely absorbed by the spectacle. He was trying very hard not to laugh. She felt bad for him. He was practically in pain, but she leaned over to finish the job. Just then there was a knock on the door. Basin called out, "I'm coming in." The door opened before they could stop him. His widened eyes were greeted by the sight of Jinchi, apparently doubled over with pain, and Maomao leaning toward him. Her face and hand were covered in something red. He didn't say anything. They didn't say anything. Shortly thereafter, Basin couldn't say anything. He was just about to shout for someone when Maomao crammed the handkerchief into his open mouth. At the same time, Jinchi pinned him down. It was the most coordinated thing they had done since the day they met. The next day, Maomao was in attendance at the discussion with the others. They were at a restaurant in the village where the landlord lived. It was not far from the papermaker's village. It probably would not have taken an hour to walk between the two villages. The restaurant was rather dreary but fairly large. The place also served as an inn. It probably usually catered to travelers on the highway, not the local people. Actually, Maomao might have stayed here last night if they hadn't ended up staying at the doctor's home. The doctor's brother-in-law and his 2 sons were there, along with 3 middle-aged men from their village. Including Maomao, Basin and Jinchi, there were 10 people in total. Maomao wondered if Basin could properly protect Jinchi if things became difficult. However, Jinchi seemed quite capable of protecting himself. It would likely be all right. Across from them were at least 15 well-built men. One of them was a middle-aged man who sat imperiously in the center of the group, stroking his facial hair. The old man and woman who ran the establishment were watching them with clear annoyance. They had likely chosen this place expecting some violence, a decision that probably didn't please the owners. The quack was visibly shaking. Maomao was the only woman present besides the restaurant owner's wife, and he seemed worried about that. No one else seemed to take any interest in the scrawny chicken girl among them. In fact, some of them were chuckling and wondering why she was even there. It had not been easy for Maomao to come, actually. Auntie Quack had tried to stop her. She pointed out that even though Maomao might not look like much, she was still an unmarried young woman. It would be awful if some terrible fate awaited her at this restaurant. More than anything, Auntie Quack said Maomao simply didn't belong at this meeting. Despite everything, Maomao had the quack looking at her piteously. Besides, she was curious about this alleged contract. She said, "I have some acquaintances who know about these kinds of things. Could I let them know what I've seen?" She was stretching the truth a little, but it would have to do. When she put it that way, Auntie, seeming to think Maomao knew some legal officials, reluctantly agreed. Maomao was actually referring to Jinchi and Basin. They were already with the group, but there was no need to mention that. So Maomao found herself sitting in a seat a short distance from the main group. The woman who worked at the establishment brought her tea. The place smelled of alcohol. Perhaps there was a tavern here as well. Maomao barely managed to keep herself from ordering some. Jinchi and Basin were seated at the table with her. "Was it really necessary for you to be here?" Basin asked. He was rehashing the subject of what had already been a rather long argument between Auntie and the doctor. If he objected, he should have said so then. The master physician requested my presence. It would have been inhumane of me to abandon him. Listen to you talk. Basin sounded like he wanted to press the issue. However, the doctor had been stealing glances at Maomao ever since they arrived, so he dropped the subject. He looked around and said, "I have to say, there is a lot of alcohol here for a place this size." The shelves were packed with wines. However, the main offering seemed to be an unrefined or cloudy wine. This wine was stored in a large barrel in the kitchen. It was a murky, whitish alcohol. In the capital, clear or distilled spirits were the drink of choice. This stuff looked like classic countryside wine. Travelers were likely offered the drink from the shelves while locals were served from the barrel. While Maomao had been distracted by the drinks, the discussions had begun. "Did you bring the money?" asked the imperious middle-aged man, sounding like a third-rate villain in a stage play. It was a natural question from him. Maomao wasn't sure if the rough-looking men around her were tenant farmers or hired muscle. Her brother-in-law and his sons and friends were well built, but they were clearly outnumbered. She looked around, thinking about where she would run if things turned violent. There was still supposed to be time. "Can't you reconsider?" the quack's brother-in-law asked meekly. Between him and the landlord sat a piece of paper, presumably the contract. "What is there to think about? I'm not just lending you that land out of the goodness of my heart, you know. If you cannot pay, then I want you out." He was giving no quarter. It sounded as though this was not the first time they had this conversation. The man continued, "Look, I like to think we are being flexible. We offered to wait until next year. We simply asked you to teach us a few things while we wait." Maomao thought it was ridiculous. The craftspeople could leave right away, or they could wait until next year. If they chose to wait, it would only give the other villagers time to learn how to make paper. They clearly had nowhere to go at this point. However, if they waited, they would be forced to surrender their trade secrets. The farmers likely hoped to receive the imperial commission as well, stepping into the craftspeople's former positions. This was enough to make a person angry, but it wouldn't usually have gone unchecked. The proof was right there on the table. Something was odd, though. Why would the papermasters teach farmers how to make paper and then force the craftsmen out? Wouldn't it be better to use the debt as leverage to force the craftsmen to work for the farming village? Did they truly hate outsiders so much? Maomao observed the middle-aged man. He was looking scornfully at the people from the paper-making village. The sons especially seemed to be the objects of his wrathful gaze. Maomao trotted over and stood behind her husband. The quack stood beside them, his moustache quivering. "What do you think you're doing?" Basin hissed, but Maomao roundly ignored him. The contract had been written more than 10 years ago. The paper still appeared in excellent shape. If it had been of lower quality, it would have grown ragged over so much time. The contract did state that monthly payments would be made in a specific amount for 20 years. At the end of the document were the hue of the individuals involved. These were called flower marks, and they served as signatures. The flower marks showed the document was valid and proper. With everything so obviously in order, Maomao could not understand why the landlord was pressing them this way. The younger son, a perceptive and thoughtful man, quietly filled her in. He said he claims the contract is invalid even though a scribe had written it, even though it has flower marks on it. Yes. They are real marks, but well, the last landlord could not read. He was illiterate, Maomao asked. That was hardly unusual, but it was puzzling. Landlords often had to review paperwork like this and were usually educated for the task. He was a son-in-law. Now it made sense. If he had been adopted into the family to take things over, all the pieces would fit together. He was probably the son of an industrious tenant farmer. He wouldn't have had time to study, and his hours would only have become more precious after he got married, even if it had occurred to him to try to learn. He never used to go to a scribe. His wife handled those things for him, but this contract evidently had been concluded after his wife's death. Maomao wanted to believe it was a real contract. The younger son claimed the flower marks were legitimate. This implied the contract had been concluded in the presence of the previous landowner. Is the scribe still around, or the witness? They have both passed, I'm afraid. The contract had been signed 15 years ago, and neither man had been young even then. This just keeps getting worse, Maomao thought. She was still getting up to speed when the landlord continued to press the impossible choice on the quack's brother-in-law. The other farmers were grinning nastily, and the craftspeople seemed to shrink back. However, the brother-in-law's older son was biting his lip, looking conflicted. If you don't think you can get out right away, I guess that only leaves one choice. We will send a couple of the youngsters over tomorrow. They can help you and you can teach them the job. You had better teach them by next year. The craftspeople's fists were shaking. The quack had come along, but he was never going to be of any help. He was as impotent as the rest of them. Only Maomao looked around. She was substantially less concerned than the others. She really was curious about that wine. She would have to order some later, but even she knew better than to do it right now in the middle of all this. The papermakers looked like they were at a funeral. The landlord, however, clearly felt festive and began ordering drinks. He said, "A round for me and all my boys." His generosity elicited a cheer from the farmers. The mistress of the establishment grudgingly brought trays full of wine cups for the drinkers. Maomao sniffed. She looked at the wine the farmers were drinking. It wasn't the cloudy kind, it was clear spirits. The landlord was drinking something different. It was an amber-coloured liquid, obviously a distilled alcohol. The liquid had come from one of the shelves. He seemed to hold his liquor well. The landlord was understandable, of course he would drink his favourite, but to order distilled liquor even for the tenant farmers, that was extremely generous, and this when there was more than enough of the only slightly less distinguished cloudy wine right there. Maomao thought about it for a moment. Then, although she felt bad for the woman carting the drinks around, who was obviously annoyed, she raised her hand and called the mistress over. "What is it?" "I would like a cup as well, please." Of the wine, the woman shrugged and gave her a drink. Young lady of all the times. The quack looked downright exasperated with her, as did his brother-in-law. Basin was also exasperated, but Jinchi motioned for her to order more. "Ah, so he has caught on." Maomao ordered cups for Jinchi and Basin. Then she drained her drink. It had a sweet flavour and a good body. It wasn't as refined as the drinks available in the capital, but it wasn't bad. Despite the mellowness of the flavour, it had a distinct alcoholic sting. If it had tasted bad, that would be explanation enough. But instead, Maomao licked her lips. They had an eating establishment that was forced to accommodate unruly customers. They also had a whole barrel of cloudy wine. However, that wasn't what they served to the unruly landlord and the farmers. So that's the story, Maomao thought. She turned to the quack's brother-in-law, who still looked exasperated. "Pardon me, but is there a distillery around here?" "No, nothing of the sort as far as I know. I figured as much." Maomao's lips twisted into a smirk. She went and stood, cup in hand, before the chattering, merrymaking landlord and his buddies. Maomao set the cup down on the table with a clear sound and offered them a smile that resembled a wild animal. "What do you want, little girl? Are you going to pour us a drink?" The landlord gave her a mocking grin, then he burst out laughing. "Young lady," the quack practically clung to her, trying to understand what she was doing. Basin almost stood up, but Jinchi gave a discreet tug on his sleeve and he sat back down. Maomao chuckled and said to the landlord, "How about a drinking contest, my good sir?" She smacked her chest demonstratively. "A drinking contest? Ha, you've got some nerve, I'll give you that," the landlord said, amused by the saucy young woman who had appeared before him. The farmers all laughed uproariously. The papermakers looked despondent, and the quack doctor was practically beside himself. Only Jinchi and Basin, both accustomed to Maomao's typical behaviour, appeared unmoved. "You can't be serious," the quack's brother-in-law said. He and his sons looked deeply worried. "It'll be all right. But I have a question. How much is left on your debt?" After a second the man replied, "It's 1,000 silver pieces a year. We've already paid half this year's amount, so that would make it 4,500. That was not an amount that just anyone would be willing to lend. Even with an imperial commission, the village was not suited to large-scale production. It wouldn't exactly be raking in the cash. All she said was, "I see." She seated herself assertively across from the landowner. "Since we are doing this, how about a bet? A bet, at a girl." Now the landlord, obviously confident in his drinking abilities, was simply making fun of her. "So do you have anything to wager?" "Yes, you have already seen it." Maomao smacked herself in the chest again. "If you sell me to a procurer, I will bring at least 300 silver. Several of the farmers spat out their drinks. The craftspeople were speechless. There was a clatter. It turned out to be Jinchi jumping out of his chair. Maomao nodded, showing her calm confidence. "Ha ha 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 ha, 300, that is a big number for such a little girl. Do you have any idea how the market works, kid?" Well, yes, that was why she had said it. She thought she had seen enough young ladies sold. The most perfect jewel in the world does not sell for more than 100, and you think the landlord was laughing so hard that spittle flew from his mouth. He was enjoying himself completely now. His friends were also good and drunk perfect. Maomao looked at them and then laughed. PFF, she made sure they knew it was a mocking sound. The drunken men picked up on it as she had hoped, and about half of them began to glare at her. You only think that because a daikon fresh out of the dirt will never go for more than 50 silver, Maomao declared. To think you don't even realize that. She felt her body jerk as someone grabbed her by the collar. They pulled her up until she was standing on her tiptoes. Her rather unflattering comparison of country girls to root vegetables hadn't gone unnoticed. Jinchi was about to make a move. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. If he involved himself now, it would only complicate things. Just say that again. Howled a farmer, we can call him farmer number 1, red in the face and coming for her with his fists raised.